Well, I think you have to do that anyway. An actor's tool is his body, and it has nothing to do with the parts you're playing. I am honestly proud to present the Herschel Humanitarian Award to Charlton Heston from my cold dead hands. He starred in over 100 movies. He won an Oscar. He marched with Martin Luther King, wise, gallant men. They knew their signatures on that Declaration of Independence, told everybody that they were willing to die for it. But in his last interview, ever Charlton Heston said something that made Peter Jennings freeze at 77. The actor famous for playing Moses admitted my life will be over soon, with his wife of 60 years by his side. Hollywood's toughest hero confessed that his mind was slipping away. The crew was so stunned that filming stopped. Nobody knew what to say to the man who'd once been the most powerful voice in America. Charlton Heston was born as John Charles Carter on October 4th, 1923 in Cook County, Illinois. His birth certificate was filed 11 days later and listed him as Charlton Carter. In his own autobiography, he wrote that he was born in Wilmette, but most official records say Evanston. That mix-up created some early confusion about his past. But of course that is true. The occasional appearance on Saturday Night Live, or Letterman, or The Tonight Show. He spent his childhood in the woods of St. Helen, Michigan. It was a quiet and lonely place. He went hunting and fishing almost every day, and later called himself a skinny hick from the woods. By 1930, census records already showed his name as Charlton J. Carter, even though the usual story says he changed his name later in life. In 1933, when he was 10 years old, his parents divorced. His mother later married Chester Heston. That's when he took the Heston name. Most people believe Charlton came from his mother's maiden name, but that's not true. It came from his grandmother, Marion Charlton. His mother and aunt were adopted by their grandfather when they were young, and they took his last name to get away from their biological father as Heston grew older and more famous. His nickname never changed. People close to him always called him Chuck. At age 17. In 1941, he made his film debut in Pure Gynt. It was a silent movie, which was strange, because sound films had been around since the late 1920s. His younger brother Alan had a small part too. This film wasn't a major production, but it was bold. It used Norwegian music and aimed to stay true to the original play. One critic later said, "The silence gave it a haunting feel." Even Charlie Chaplin had moved on from silent films. By then, critics often called this one of Heston's least important roles. But it was his first step into film that same year. He joined Northwestern University in the spring of 1941. He met Lydia Clark in a theater class. He was shy and poor and worked long hours. He ran elevators at night and took any job he could find during the day. Even with all that he noticed Lydia, they fell in love quickly on March 17th, 1944. They got married in Greensboro, North Carolina. They stayed together for 64 years, until his death in 2008. They raised 2 children, Fraser Clark Heston and Holly Heston Rosell. Even when film projects kept them apart, their bond stayed strong. Heston once said he was more in love after 9 years of marriage than he was on their wedding day. His television career began on March 15th, 1949, when he appeared on Suspense a few months later on June 15th, 1949. He made his debut on Studio One. That show gave him the chance to play complex roles. He played Edward Rochester in Jane Eyre on December 12th, 1949. He was Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights on October 30th, 1950. He also played Macbeth on October 22nd, 1951. These roles helped him grow, The CBS team gave Studio One more money and better sets than other shows. Some people thought Heston seemed stiff at first, but others noticed his presence and strong voice. He stood out by 1955. The show was getting more than 500 scripts each week. Heston was becoming a serious actor when Betty Davis says it. You figure it must be true. But really, I think I won this award for doing the kind of chores a whole lot of other people do too. But because I'm an actor when I do them. They take my picture in 1950. He took on 2 major projects. One was a low-budget film version of Julius Caesar, where he played Mark Antony. He was the only paid actor in that Chicago production. It was directed by David Bradley, an old friend from his youth. His big Hollywood debut came in Dark City. He played Danny Haley, a bitter gambler who ran an illegal bookie joint. Heston was 25. At the time, the film wasn't a huge hit, but director Cecil B. DeMille saw it and was impressed in 1952. DeMille cast him in The Greatest Show on Earth. Heston played Brad Braden, a tough circus manager with a hidden soft side. Critics said he brought a Bogart style. Toughness to the role the film won Best Picture at the Oscars. That role proved Heston could lead a major film. In 1954, he starred in 2 adventure films. The first was The Naked Jungle. He played Christopher Leaning in A Plantation Owner, fighting off a plague of army ants and dealing with a tense. Marriage director Byron Haskin created groundbreaking effects for the ant scenes. Critics noted how bold the film was for showing sexual tension between Heston and co-star Eleanor Parker. Right after that, Heston flew to Peru for Secret of the Incas. It was the first big Hollywood film to shoot at Machu Picchu. The crew had 16 people and worked with 500 local extras. He played Harry Steele, a treasure hunter looking for a lost artifact. That role later inspired the character of Indiana. Jones the film also caused a spike in tourism to Peru later in 1954. DeMille began casting for The 10 Commandments. At first he wanted William Boyd, who played Hopalong. Cassidy Boyd turned it down because of his television work, The Mill. Then looked at Jeff Chandler, Dan Daly, Kirk Douglas, and even Rock Hudson. The turning point came when the Mill received a sculpture of Michelangelo's Moses. From the Israeli government, he saw the strong resemblance between that statue and Heston that helped him make the final choice. Even then, he had doubts in his diary. DeMille wrote that Heston had a sinister quality and wasn't especially attractive, but he still gave him the part. There was one last surprise. Heston's son, Fraser, had just been born. Producer Henry Wilcoxon suggested using him as baby Moses in the basket scene. He was only 3 months old. DeMille agreed. Heston ended up playing both Moses and the voice of God in the burning bush scenes. By 1956, he was no longer just an actor. He had become the face of biblical epics and one of the most powerful figures on screen. When MGM started planning Ben-Hur in the late 1950s, it was already set to be the biggest and most expensive film Hollywood had ever made. But finding the right actor for the lead role turned into a long and messy search. Charlton Heston was not their first choice. He wasn't even near the top of the list. The studio first offered the part to Burt Lancaster. He turned it down. He thought the script was boring and even offensive toward Christianity. Then they went to Paul Newman. He had just starred in The Silver Chalice in 1954, a biblical film that flopped. Newman still felt embarrassed by it and didn't want to do another. He even joked that he didn't have the legs to wear a Roman costume. Marlon Brando also passed the studio, kept trying. They looked at Rock Hudson, even though some at MGM doubted he could handle the role. At one point, they even thought about casting Leslie Nielsen, who at the time was a serious actor and not yet known for comedy. Nothing worked. MGM got so desperate, they started looking at Italian actors who didn't even speak English. That's when director William Wyler turned to Charlton Heston. Heston had already played Moses in the Ten Commandments. In 1956, he had the voice, he had the presence, and he looked like someone who could command a Roman chariot. The production was massive. Just the chariot race alone cost $1 million. It took 5 weeks to film. Across 3 months, the race covered more than 200 miles of actual track. Heston started training. As soon as he arrived in Rome, every day for 3 hours, he practiced driving a chariot. He had to learn how to handle the horses and the turns. The dirt would fly up into his face, so he wore special contact lenses to protect his eyes. One of the most famous moments in the race came from a real accident. Stuntman Joe Conant was the son of Yakima. Conant, the legendary stunt coordinator, during one jump, Joe was thrown high into the air and slammed down hard. He hurt his chin, but survived. Wyler used that real footage in the final film. He cut it together with close UPS of Heston, climbing back into the chariot. That shot became one of the most iconic moments in the movie. The production used 78 trained horses brought in from Yugoslavia and Sicily. Heston's team had Andalusians, while the other teams used Lipizans. When Ben-Hur was released in 1959, it became a sensation at the 32nd Academy Awards. It won 11 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Heston, that set a record that lasted almost 40 years, until Titanic tied it in 1997. Heston had never won a competitive Oscar before, and never would again. But this one performance changed everything. From that point on, he became Hollywood's go-to actor for historical epics. Critics called him the symbol of a time when Hollywood made serious films with serious heroes. After Ben-Hur, Heston had the power to pick his own projects in 1961. He played El Cid in 1965. He played Michelangelo in The Agony and the Ecstasy. That same year, he played John the Baptist in The Greatest Story Ever Told. Roger Ebert later said, Heston made at least 3 films that almost everyone sees. At some point, Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes. But even with all this success, Heston made some surprising choices in 1960. He turned down a big studio film with Marilyn Monroe called Let's Make Love. Instead, he went to Broadway. He wanted to work with Laurence Olivier, who was directing a play called The Tumbler by Ben W. Levy. The play opened in Boston and had a rough start. Then it moved to New York and closed after just 5 performances. In February 1960, Time magazine called it harrowingly pretentious. It was a major failure. Still, Heston said it was worth it. He told columnist Joe Himes that he learned more from Olivia in 6 weeks than he could have learned on his own later. That same year, he made The Wreck of the Merry Deer with Gary Cooper. It was a sea thriller based on a novel by Hammond Innes. The story started with mystery, but turned into a courtroom drama. Halfway through, critics didn't like the shift in tone. One reviewer said the ending was the weakest part. The film still made money. MGM records showed it earned $1.165 million in the US and Canada, and $1.65 million overseas. It cost $6 million to make, so it turned a small profit of $200. Zero. But it didn't live up to the studio's hopes. Heston later said the screenplay failed to capture the power of the novel. He also blamed the director Michael Anderson for not getting the courtroom scenes right. In 1961, Heston returned to epics with El Cid. The film was shot over 9 months in Spain, and it became famous for what happened off-camera. Heston and co-star Sophia Loren could barely stand each other. Their hatred was well known in the industry. They had strong chemistry on screen. But behind the scenes, they fought constantly when producer Samuel Bronston later tried to cast them together again in the fall of the Roman Empire. Heston refused that decision, caused problems for Bronston. Some believe it helped push his studio toward financial collapse when freedom shivers in the cold shadow of true peril. It's always the patriots who first hear the call. Sid was a massive box office. Hit the costumes were real. The weapons were real. The Spanish army even took part as extras. Bronston made a fortune and used the success to fund more epics. But Heston began to feel trapped. He had played Moses. He had played Ben-Hur now. He was playing another historical legend. He worried that he was being locked into these roles forever. In 1968, Charlton Heston took a sharp turn in his career with Planet of the Apes. It changed how science fiction looked and felt. The ape makeup was a huge challenge. It took up to 7 hours to apply, and 3 hours to remove. That meant actors would have to start work at 2 a.m. and go until 10 p.m. Makeup artist John Chambers solved the problem using foam rubber that let skin breathe, and special paint that didn't block pores. Filming started on May 21st, 1967. The studio spent $345. All zero on makeup, but told the press it was $1 million. Shooting was rough. The actors wore full prosthetics in desert heat. They drank liquid meals through straws to avoid ruining their makeup off camera. They grouped themselves by ape species without meaning to. Gorillas sat with gorillas. Orangutans with orangutans. Cinematographer Leon Shamroy built a metal sled to film the astronauts, sliding down slopes around the same time. A satirical article made fake claims about Heston. It said he made inappropriate comments to a stagehand in May 1967 and invited her for drinks. It even joked that she had nightmares of Heston in an ape suit. The story was fiction. It mocked cancel culture by copying the style of real news. In 1971, Heston starred in The Omega Man. It was based on I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Heston played a man alone after a pandemic destroyed the world. The movie earned $4 million in the US and Canada. Matheson said it was so far from his book, he didn't care. Over time, it became a cult hit. Tim Burton called it his desert island pick, and said it was the first film he saw with funny action lines. Then came Soylent Green. In 1973, it was set in the year 2022, in a polluted New York with 40 million people. The world was falling apart from the greenhouse effect and overpopulation. This was one of the first films to talk about climate change. It was based on the 1966 novel Make Room. Make Room by Harry Harrison, but the twist Soylent Green is made of people was not in the book. Screenwriter Stanley Greenberg added that Harrison hated it. Cinematographer Richard Klein used green filters to give the film a sick, toxic look. In 1974, Heston starred in Earthquake. The film used 141 stunt performers, the most ever at the time. Heston was 50 and still did many of his own stunts. The camera system shook the whole frame to mimic real tremors. Stunt workers were inches away from 6-ton concrete blocks. One was knocked out during a flood scene. Another was hurt during an elevator crash in 1972. Heston directed Anthony and Cleopatra. It was a dream project he wanted Orson Welles to direct, but took over when Welles said, no, critics hated. The film the naval battle used recycled shots from Ben-Hur and looked cheap. Heston gave himself long, close UPS. and ignored pacing, the film failed and never recovered. Charlton, Heston didn't start as the conservative icon. Many remember in the 1950s, he was a committed Democrat. His first political campaign was in 1956, when he supported Adlai Stevenson against Dwight Eisenhower. Stevenson lost, but Heston stayed active. He backed John F. Kennedy in 1960 and celebrated his win by the early 1960s. Heston became more than just a supporter. He took real action. He stepped into civil rights work at a time when most actors stayed silent. On August 28, 1963, Heston marched in Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He didn't stand in the background. He LED'd the arts group that day around 2:50. Two rural people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, ladies and gentlemen of the National Rifle Association. Your first Vice President, Mr. Charlton Heston. Heston later said it was the most important moment in the civil rights movement. He believed that March helped push the Civil Rights Act through Congress. The next year, he called Dr. King a 20th century Moses, which hit deep, considering Heston had played Moses in the Ten Commandments just 7 years earlier. He knew his actions could hurt his career, but he didn't back down. He once said, "I marched for civil rights with Dr. King in 1963, and long before Hollywood found it acceptable. I may say he believed democracy only worked if people stood up for it." In his words, if you believe in democracy, you have to believe in how it works. But Heston's views didn't stay in one place. After Robert Kennedy and Dr. King were killed, in 1968, he called for stricter gun laws. He said Congress wasn't doing enough and wanted stronger limits on handguns, shotguns, and rifles. But over time, he changed. In 1972, while filming The Omega Man, his views started to shift by the late 1990s. He had joined the NRA. In 1997, he joined the NRA board. In 1998, he became its president. He stayed in that role until 2003, while he was president. NRA membership passed 4 million. In 2000, he stood on stage at the NRA convention in Charlotte and raised a rifle above his head. He said the now famous words from My Cold Dead Hands. It was a defining moment. Heston became the face of the gun rights movement during a time when Democrats were stepping back from that debate. He believed that shift in support for the Second Amendment was something close to a promise fulfilled. He saw it as a victory for personal freedom. In 1999, he gave a powerful speech at Harvard Law School. The date was February 16th. The room was packed. Heston told the students they were part of the most politically silenced generation in America since the start of the Revolution. He said their silence was a sign of fear. He talked about how in the 1960s, people used terms like Negro and Black during marches, but now those same words were banned from conversation. I said, I don't want to do a book now I just finished selling the last one. I said, I'm going to do a movie now. He said no. And he told me the title, and I said, oh, you got me. Yeah. He believed this was a sign that people were no longer allowed to speak freely. He called the speech, Winning the Cultural War. He warned that once people are told what to say, it becomes easier to tell them what to do. He challenged the students to resist that pressure, just like Dr. King did. He said, peaceful protest still mattered. Then came a moment no one expected. In August 2000, Heston revealed that he had entered rehab earlier that year from late May to mid-June. He stayed at a center in Utah. He was 76. He told the National Enquirer that he had given up whiskey years before, but had developed a habit of drinking too much white wine. He drank during flights and dinner events. He said he wasn't slurring or stumbling, but he knew it had become a problem. His publicist Lisa De Matteo said his schedule was part of the issue he was performing. The play love letters with his wife Lydia, leading the NRA, and campaigning for George W. Bush. Heston also said the harsh reviews from London critics after his West End performance had hit him hard, but it was his wife and son who finally convinced him to get help. Charlton and Lydia married on March 17, 1944. In Greensboro, North Carolina, he was about to leave for the Aleutian Islands with the Air Corps. Her father said the marriage would last 2 weeks. It lasted 64 years. Their relationship had struggles. He traveled often for film shoots and events. He said being away from her reminded him how lonely life could be. They were very different. He was always on time and disorganized. She was often late and very neat. Rumors came and went about cheating and arguments. Heston denied all of it. He said he had loved Lydia since he was 17. He never wanted to risk their marriage. They learned how to handle fights. They had a rule: never go to sleep before fixing an argument. In 1998, doctors discovered something during hip surgery. Heston had prostate cancer. He was 73. The diagnosis was a shock, but it came early. He said it wasn't life-threatening. Still, he had a choice to make. He delayed treatment to finish filming and support Republican candidates in the 1998 election. Then he began treatment. He went through radiation 5 days a week, each morning at 7 a.m. He showed up for therapy, then he went to work. At the time, he was filming Town and Country with Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton. He didn't miss a beat in 2001. He announced that he was cancer-free on August 9th, 2002. Charlton Heston sat alone on screen. His voice was steady. His eyes were focused at 77 years old. The actor who once played Moses and Ben-Hur revealed something far more personal than any role I'm exercising. One of the rights passed on down to me from those wise old dead white guys that invented this country. He had been diagnosed with symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. The video message had been recorded just 2 days earlier on August 7th, in private with no crowd, no press. His spokesperson, Lisa Powers, later explained why he wanted to get the words exactly right. He wanted to say them himself from start to finish. The background was plain. The framing was tight. Heston's presence was still powerful, but this time there was no script and no audience. Only truth. He looked into the camera and said, "I wanted to prepare a few words for you now, because when the time comes, I may not be able to." Then he added something that cut even deeper. For an actor, there's no greater loss than the loss of his audience. I can part the Red Sea, but I can't part with you. He didn't hide from what was coming. Instead, he faced it head-on. Despite the diagnosis, Heston refused to step away immediately from public life. He said he would continue to serve as president of the National Rifle Association until April 2003. He planned to keep speaking at political events as long as he could. And before ending the message, he quoted lines from Shakespeare's The Tempest, spoken from memory, one last moment of performance. From a man who had built his life around the stage just 4 months later, in December 2nd. 2. He gave what would become his final televised interview. ABC's Peter Jennings sat with him at his home. Lydia, his wife of nearly 60 years, stayed by his side. The change in Heston was already visible. He spoke more slowly. Sometimes he forgot words. At times he repeated himself, but he remained aware of what was happening when Jennings asked him about his illness. Heston didn't hesitate. He said about Alzheimer's, "As you know, the problem is not for you. The problem is for all those around. He knew what was coming. He spoke quietly but clearly, how long and how well I can sustain my condition as it is now, and when it stops being, that my life will change. Beyond a certain point, my life will be over. That was his fear. Not just forgetting, but no longer being able to say goodbye. That's why he made his diagnosis public. He said he never wanted to reach a point where he couldn't share that part of his life. I can part the Red Sea, but I can't part with you, which is why I won't exclude you from this stage in my life. After the announcement, support poured in. One of the first to call was Nancy Reagan. She didn't ask to speak with Charlton. She wanted to speak with Lydia. She knew from her own life that Alzheimer's didn't just affect the person diagnosed. It changed everything for the people who cared for them too. Charlton Heston lived with Alzheimer's for over 5 years. On April 5th, 2008, he died at home in Beverly Hills. He was 84. The official cause was complications from the disease. By then he had been silent for some time, but the tributes were loud and full of praise. President George W. Bush, who had awarded Heston the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2003, called him a man of character and integrity with a big heart. He mentioned Heston's service in World War II, his work in the Civil Rights Movement, his leadership in the Screen Actors Guild, and his fierce defense of the Second Amendment. Nancy Reagan said she was heartbroken. She called him a hero in real life, not just on screen. In her words, he had always stepped up to support her husband back in 2003, when Heston stepped down from the NRA. Florida Governor Jeb Bush told him something that stood out. He said, "Were it not for your active involvement, it's safe to say, my brother may not have been President of the United States." That one line said everything about Heston's political influence. During the 2000 election, his funeral took place on April 12, 2008, at the Episcopal Parish of St. Matthew's in Pacific Palisades. The church where he had worshipped since the early 1980s, about 250 people attended. It was a gathering of Hollywood legends and political figures. Nancy Reagan came, so did Arnold Schwarzenegger, Olivia de Havilland, Tom Selleck, Oliver Stone, and Christian Bale. After the ceremony, Heston was cremated. His ashes were returned to the family he had loved and protected for 64 years